The morning sun cast long shadows across Mill Creek's quiet streets as Harold Thompson, a 93-year-old World War II veteran, carefully locked the front door of his modest White House. His weathered hands, marked with age spots and old scars, held onto a wooden cane that had been his faithful companion for the past decade. The soft tap of the cane against the concrete sidewalk echoed through the peaceful neighborhood as he began his daily 3-block journey to Pete's Diner. Harold had lived in this small town for over 60 years, moving here with his beloved wife Marion after returning from the war. The house they had chosen together still looked much the same, though Marion was no longer there to tend to her beloved rose garden. 5 years had passed since her passing, but Harold still found himself turning to share comments with her throughout the day, only to be met with silence. The walk to Pete's Diner had become more than just a morning routine. It was Harold's way of staying connected to the world. Every morning, without fail, he would put on his neatly pressed clothes, polish his old brown shoes, and make sure his silver hair was properly combed. Marion had always said that presentation mattered, and he wasn't about to let her down, even now. As he walked, Harold nodded to Mrs. Peterson, who was already out watering her front garden. She had moved to Mill Creek 15 years ago, and her grandchildren often helped Harold carry his groceries home from the local store. The town had changed over the decades, but this sense of community had remained constant, like a warm blanket wrapped around its residents. Pete's Diner sat on the corner of Maple and Main Street, its red and white awning a familiar sight that had greeted Harold every morning for the past 30 years. The building itself wasn't much to look at, just a simple one-story structure with large windows and a slightly crooked neon sign that buzzed softly in the early morning light. But to Harold, it was a second home. The bell above the door chimed softly as Harold pushed it open, and the warm smell of coffee and fresh-baked bread wrapped around him like an old friend's embrace. Sarah, the morning waitress who had worked there for over a decade, looked up from behind the counter with a bright smile. "Morning, Mr. Thompson. Your usual booth is waiting for you." Harold's usual spot was the corner booth near the window, where the morning light streamed in just right and he could watch the town come to life. The vinyl seats were worn smooth from years of use, and the table had a small scratch near the edge that Harold's wedding ring had made over countless breakfasts. Sarah already had his coffee waiting, black with just a touch of sugar, served in the thick white mug he preferred. As he settled into his booth, Harold's mind drifted back to the countless mornings he had shared this same space with Marion. She would always order the blueberry pancakes, insisting they were the best in 3 counties, while he stuck to his simple breakfast of 2 eggs over easy, toast, and bacon. The routine hadn't changed since her passing. He still ordered enough toast for 2, sharing the extra pieces with the sparrows that gathered outside the diner's window. The other regular customers began filtering in as they did every morning. There was Tom, the local mailman, who always grabbed a quick coffee before starting his route. Jenny, the high school English teacher, would stop by for her breakfast sandwich, often sharing stories about her students with Harold. And old Doc Williams, retired now but still maintaining his habit of reading the morning paper at the counter. These people had become Harold's extended family over the years. They knew about his service in the war, though he rarely spoke of it. They had attended Marion's funeral, bringing casseroles and comfort in equal measure. They checked on him during bad weather and celebrated his birthdays with surprise parties that weren't really surprises anymore. As Sarah brought over his usual breakfast order, Harold smoothed his napkin across his lap. Another habit Marion had instilled in him. The morning sunlight caught the small American flag pin on his jacket lapel, a subtle reminder of his service and the life he had lived. This was his world now, simple, predictable, and comforting in its familiarity. Little did he know that this peaceful routine was about to face an unexpected challenge. The peaceful atmosphere at Pete's Diner changed dramatically one sunny Tuesday morning. Harold was just settling into his usual corner booth when the ground seemed to vibrate beneath his feet. The rumbling grew louder until it filled the entire diner, and through the large windows, he watched as a group of motorcycles pulled into the parking lot, their chrome parts gleaming in the morning sun. Sarah, the waitress, paused with a coffee pot in her hand as 12 men in leather jackets walked through the door. They called themselves the Road Warriors, as proudly displayed on the patches sewn across their backs. Their heavy boots thumped against the worn linoleum floor, and the peaceful chatter in the diner quickly died down to nervous whispers. The bikers spread out across the diner, taking up several booths and pushing tables together. Their loud voices bounced off the walls as they called out orders and joked among themselves. Harold noticed how other regular customers seemed to shrink in their seats, and even Tom, the mailman who usually stayed for a second cup of coffee, quickly finished his breakfast and left. Pete, the diner's owner, emerged from the kitchen with a worried look on his face. He was a short man with kind eyes and flour, always dusting his apron, but today his usual cheerful expression was replaced with concern. The bikers were demanding service, snapping their fingers at Sarah and making comments that made her face turn red with discomfort. Harold watched as one of the bikers, a tall man with a thick beard and tattoos covering his arms, pointed at the small American flag pin on Harold's lapel. "Hey, Grandpa," the man called out, his voice carrying across the diner. "Did you get that pin from a gift shop, or are you pretending to be something you're not?" The other bikers laughed, and Harold felt his hands tighten around his coffee cup. He had earned that pin through blood and sacrifice, but he remained silent, something he had learned long ago in the war. Sometimes silence was the best response to provocation. As the days passed, the road warriors made Pete's Diner their regular morning meeting spot. They would arrive just as Harold was finishing his breakfast, their motorcycles taking up most of the parking spaces. Some of the diner's regular customers stopped coming altogether, unable to handle the intimidating atmosphere the bikers brought with them. Harold noticed how Sarah's hands would shake slightly as she served the bikers, especially when they made rude comments or deliberately spilled their drinks for her to clean up. Pete tried to maintain order, but the bikers seemed to take pleasure in pushing boundaries, seeing how far they could go before someone would stand up to them. One morning, Harold arrived to find his regular booth occupied by 3 of the road warriors. They had deliberately taken his spot, their leather jackets spread across the vinyl seats where he had sat every morning for the past 30 years. The scratch on the table that his wedding ring had made was now hidden beneath a motorcycle magazine. "Looking for something, old-timer?" one of them asked, a mocking smile spreading across his face. The others snickered, watching Harold stand there with his cane, uncertainty flickering across his weathered features. Sarah stepped forward, her voice trembling slightly. "That's Mr. Thompson's regular spot," she said. "He's been sitting there longer than I've worked here." The bikers exchanged amused glances. "Well," said the one with the thick beard, "looks like Mr. Thompson needs to learn about change. Nothing stays the same forever, right, Cramps?" Harold felt something shift inside him, a familiar feeling he hadn't experienced since his days in uniform. It wasn't fear. He had faced far worse than these men during the war. It wasn't even anger, though their disrespect stung. It was determination, the same kind that had kept him going through the darkest days of combat. As he stood there, leaning on his cane and looking at these men who thought they could bully an old veteran, Harold made a decision. He wouldn't be driven away from his routine, from his memories of Marion, from his place in this community. Something would have to change, but it wouldn't be him leaving. The tension at Pete's Diner grew worse with each passing day. Harold now found himself arriving earlier in the morning, hoping to finish his breakfast before the road warriors showed up. But the bikers seemed to notice this change in his routine, and they too began arriving earlier, turning their harassment into a cruel game. They would deliberately bump his table as they walked past, causing his coffee to spill. Sometimes they would imitate his walk, hunched over and pretending to use invisible canes, drawing cruel laughter from their group. The worst part for Harold wasn't their mockery. It was watching how their behavior affected the diner's other customers and staff. Sarah had started taking fewer morning shifts, unable to handle the stress of dealing with the bikers. Pete had called the police twice, but the road warriors were careful to never do anything that technically broke the law. They were smart about their bullying, keeping it just on the edge of what was legally acceptable. One quiet morning, as Harold carefully cut into his eggs, he overheard 2 of the bikers talking about him. "Look at him, acting all high and mighty with his veteran's pin," one said, loud enough for Harold to hear. "Bet he never even saw real action. Probably spent the war pushing papers somewhere safe." Harold's hand tightened around his fork. Those words hit harder than the others because they couldn't know, about the friends he'd lost on Omaha Beach, about the nightmares that still woke him up sometimes, about the metal box in his closet that he couldn't bring himself to open anymore. Jenny, the English teacher who was still brave enough to come to the diner, watched with worried eyes as the harassment continued. She had tried to stand up for Harold once, telling the bikers about how he had given talks at her school about World War II. They had just laughed and suggested she find a younger, more interesting speaker. That morning, something different happened. As Harold reached for his water glass, one of the younger bikers deliberately knocked into his table, harder than usual. The glass tipped over, spilling across Harold's lap and soaking his carefully pressed trousers. These were the pants Marion had bought him for their last anniversary together, and now they were stained with water and coffee. The biker grinned, not even pretending it was an accident this time. "Oops," he said, drawing out the word. "Looks like Grandpa had a little accident. Maybe it's time for the nursing home, old-timer." Pete rushed over with a towel, his face red with anger. "That's enough," he shouted, surprising everyone in the diner. "You can't treat people this way in my restaurant." The leader of the Road Warriors stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. He towered over Pete, using his height to intimidate. "Can't we?" he asked softly, dangerously. "And who's going to stop us? You? The old man?" Harold watched this scene unfold, and suddenly he could see it all clearly. The fear in Pete's eyes, the trembling in Sarah's hands as she watched from behind the counter, the way the other customers seemed to hold their breath. It reminded him of something he'd seen long ago, in a small French village, where bullies in different uniforms had tried to intimidate the locals. In that moment, Harold remembered what his commanding officer had told him during the war. "Sometimes, Thompson, the bravest thing isn't fighting back, it's knowing how to fight smart." He had been young then, eager to charge into battle, but now he understood those words better than ever. As he stood up from his wet seat, water dripping from his clothes, Harold didn't say a word. He simply reached into his wallet and pulled out a worn brown leather case he carried with him every day since 1945. It was time to show these men exactly who they were dealing with, and he would do it in a way they would never forget. The diner fell completely silent as Harold opened the worn leather case. His hands didn't shake. They were steady, just as they had been on D-Day when everything depended on keeping them steady. The Road Warriors watched with mixed expressions of curiosity and mockery as he carefully laid out 3 items on his still-wet table. The first was a photograph, its edges worn soft from years of handling. The black and white image showed a group of young soldiers standing in front of a tank, their faces dirty but smiling. The second item was a Purple Heart medal, its purple and gold surface still bright despite its age. The third was a Bronze Star, a testament to valor that few civilians ever earned. "You boys want to know who I am?" Harold's voice was clear and strong, carrying across the silent diner. "Let me tell you about June 6, 1944. He picked up the photograph and held it where everyone could see. "This was my unit. We were part of the first wave at Omaha Beach." The leader of the Road Warriors started to smirk, but something in Harold's eyes made him stop. These weren't the eyes of a frail old man anymore. They were the eyes of a soldier who had seen things these bikers couldn't imagine. "See this young man right here?" Harold pointed to a soldier in the photo who was grinning broadly. "That's Jimmy Martinez. He saved 3 men that day before a German bullet found him. He was 19. Harold's finger moved to another face. "And this is Frank O'Malley. He stepped on a mine 2 days after this picture was taken. Lost both legs, but never lost his spirit." The bikers shifted uncomfortably in their seats as Harold continued. "This Purple Heart?" He touched the medal gently. "Got this pulling 2 of my buddies out of a burning tank. The metal was so hot it melted part of my uniform into my skin. Want to see the scars?" Sarah had moved closer, tears in her eyes. Even Pete had stopped wiping down the counter, listening intently to words Harold had never shared before. The younger biker who had spilled water on Harold earlier had backed away slightly, his earlier bravado fading. The Bronze Star came later, during the Battle of the Bulge. "Temperature was so cold our rifles would freeze. We ate snow because our water was frozen solid. Lost 3 toes to frostbite, but we held the line." Harold's voice remained steady, but his eyes had taken on a distant look, seeing things from long ago. He turned to face the Road Warriors leader directly. "You asked if I got this pin from a gift shop?" Harold touched the American flag pin on his lapel. "This pin belonged to my best friend, Bobby Thompson, no relation. He gave it to me the day before he died, taking a bullet that was meant for me, said his luck was in it. Guess he was right." The diner remained silent as Harold carefully arranged the medals and photographed back in their case. "You boys think you're tough because you ride in a group and pick on old men. Let me tell you about tough. Tough is watching your friends die and still moving forward. Tough is being scared to death but doing your duty anyway. Tough is living with memories that wake you up at night, even 70 years later, and still getting up every morning to face another day. Harold stood up straight, his cane forgotten against the booth. I earned my place in this diner, in this town, in this country. I paid for it with blood and tears and lost friends. So no, I won't be leaving. And if you have any respect for the freedom you enjoy, the freedom my friends died for, you'll think long and hard about how you've been behaving in here. The leader of the road warriors had gone pale, his eyes fixed on the leather case in Harold's hands. For the first time, the bikers saw not a frail old man before them, but a warrior who had faced down things far more frightening than a group of men on motorcycles. The real question now was, what would they do with this new understanding? The silence in Pete's diner seemed to stretch on forever after Harold finished speaking. The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching dust motes in its beams and highlighting the tears that had formed in Sarah's eyes. Even the usual sounds of the kitchen had stopped, as if the whole building was holding its breath. The leader of the road warriors, a man everyone called Buck, stood up slowly from his seat. His face had lost its usual hardness, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. He walked over to Harold's table, his heavy boots making no sound on the linoleum floor. When he reached the table, he did something that shocked everyone in the diner. He pulled out his own wallet. "Mr. Thompson," Buck said, his voice rough with emotion, "I need to show you something too." His hands trembled slightly as he removed an old, creased photograph. "This is my grandfather, Richard Mason. He served in World War II, just like you." Harold looked at the photograph carefully. It showed a young soldier standing next to a military jeep, wearing the same unit insignia that Harold's unit had worn. His eyes widened with recognition. "Richie Mason?" Harold's voice was barely a whisper. "Little Richie from Nebraska." He looked up at Buck, seeing for the first time a familiar set to the jaw, the same way of standing. "He was one of the best radio operators we had. Saved our unit more times than I can count by getting messages through when nobody else could." Buck nodded, swallowing hard. "He died last year," he said quietly. "But he used to tell me stories about the war, about his unit. He talked about a surgeon who carried him half a mile to safety when he was hit by shrapnel." Buck's eyes fixed on Harold's purple heart. "That was you, wasn't it?" Harold's eyes misted over as he remembered that day. "Your grandfather was too stubborn to die," he said with a gentle smile. "Kept telling jokes the whole way back to the aid station, even with his leg torn up. Said if he was going to die, he was going to die laughing." The other road warriors had gathered around now, their earlier hostility completely forgotten. One by one, they began sharing stories about their own family members who had served, fathers, uncles, grandfathers who had fought in various wars. "Mr. Thompson," Buck said, his voice cracking slightly, "I can't begin to tell you how ashamed I am. We've been acting like nothing but common thugs, disrespecting a man who saved my grandfather's life." He turned to face his fellow bikers. "We're supposed to be about brotherhood, about standing up for what's right. Instead, we've been bullying a hero." Sarah appeared with fresh coffee for everyone, her hands steady now as she poured. Pete had come out from behind the counter, listening intently as Harold began sharing more stories about Richie Mason. Funny moments during training, close calls during combat, the way he could fix any radio no matter how badly it was damaged. The other regular customers in the diner watched in amazement as the transformation unfolded. The road warriors, who had been so intimidating just minutes before, now sat or stood around Harold's table like children listening to a beloved grandfather's stories. Jenny, the English teacher, wiped tears from her eyes as she watched. This was the kind of moment she tried to teach her students about, when truth and courage could change hearts in an instant. "Your grandfather," Harold said to Buck, "made me promise something before we left Europe. He made me promise that if I ever met his family, I'd tell them how proud they should be of him." He reached out and patted Buck's hand. "Richie Mason was one of the finest men I ever knew. And I think, underneath all that leather and attitude, he'd be proud of who you can become too." The morning sun grew stronger, warming the diner as healing began to take place, not just between Harold and the bikers, but within the entire community that had been affected by their presence. That evening, after the remarkable events at Pete's diner, Buck couldn't sleep. He sat in his small apartment, surrounded by old boxes he hadn't opened in years. Finally, he found what he was looking for, his grandfather's military trunk. Inside were letters, more photographs, and a worn journal he had never read before. As Buck turned the pages of his grandfather's journal, his hands shaking, he found entry after entry mentioning Sergeant Thompson. There were stories of bravery, of kindness, of leadership that had kept young soldiers alive through the darkest days of the war. Buck read until the sun came up, tears occasionally falling onto the yellowed pages. Meanwhile, Harold sat in his quiet house, looking at his own collection of war memorabilia. He hadn't opened these boxes in years, but now he carefully sorted through them, pulling out photographs and letters that mentioned Richie Mason. His late wife Marion had kept everything organized, labeled with her neat handwriting. Richie's wedding announcement, Richie's first son, Christmas card from the Masons, 1960. The next morning, Harold arrived at Pete's diner at his usual time, but things were different. The parking lot was empty of motorcycles, and for a moment, he felt a strange disappointment. But as he walked through the door, he found Buck sitting alone in a booth, waiting for him. "Mr. Thompson," Buck said, standing up quickly. "I spent all night reading my grandfather's journal. I found something I think you should see." He pulled out a carefully preserved letter, dated just a few months before Richie Mason's death. It was addressed to his grandson, but had never been mailed. Harold sat down, his breakfast forgotten, as he read the letter. In it, Richie had written about his time in the war, and specifically about Harold. "If you ever meet Sergeant Thompson," the letter read, "know that you're meeting the man who not only saved my life, but taught me what real strength looks like. He showed us that true courage isn't about being tough or scary. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard." Sarah watched from behind the counter as the two men talked, their heads bent over photographs and letters. She noticed how Buck kept wiping his eyes, how Harold's hand would occasionally reach out to pat the younger man's shoulder in comfort. Other customers began arriving, including some of the regular morning crowd who had been staying away. They were surprised to see Buck sitting with Harold, their table covered with old photographs and papers. Jenny, the English teacher, stopped by their booth, and Harold began showing her pictures of young Richie Mason with his radio equipment. "My grandfather wrote about how you saved the entire unit one night," Buck said, his voice filled with pride. "When the Germans had you surrounded, and he got that vital message through to headquarters. He said you never left his side, kept him calm while he worked on the radio, even though shells were falling all around you." Harold nodded, remembering that terrible night. "Your grandfather had magic in his fingers when it came to those radios. Without him, none of us would have made it home." As the morning went on, other road warriors began arriving, but this time they came without their usual noise and swagger. Each one approached Harold's table respectfully, introducing themselves properly and asking to hear more stories about the war, about their own relatives who had served, what it really meant to be brave. Pete watched all this from behind his counter, a smile on his face as he saw his diner returning to the peaceful place it had always been. But it was more than peaceful now. It was becoming a place of healing, of understanding, of bridges being built between generations. Sarah brought over fresh coffee for everyone, and this time when she approached the bikers, her hands were steady and her smile was genuine. The morning sun streamed through the windows, warming the scene as Harold opened another envelope of photographs, ready to share more memories with these men who were quickly becoming something he had never expected. Friends. A week had passed since the emotional revelation at Pete's diner, and the town of Mill Creek was witnessing an extraordinary change. The road warriors had transformed from feared troublemakers into respectful protectors, especially when it came to Harold Thompson. But the biggest surprise came on a bright Monday morning when Buck showed up at Harold's front door. "Mr. Thompson," Buck said, standing nervously on the porch, "I was wondering if you'd like a ride to the diner today." Behind him, parked in Harold's driveway, was his motorcycle, freshly washed and polished. Next to it stood 3 other road warriors, all looking hopeful. Harold looked at the motorcycle, then at his cane, a small smile forming on his face. "It's been about 50 years since I was on one of those," he said. "Marion always said they were too dangerous." He paused, then added with a twinkle in his eye, "But she's not here to scold me anymore, is she?" Buck helped Harold secure his cane to the motorcycle and showed him how to hold on properly. The other bikers watched with approval as their leader carefully guided the old veteran onto the back of his bike. Mrs. Peterson, watering her garden as usual, nearly dropped her hose in surprise when she saw Harold Thompson, sitting tall and proud on a motorcycle, rolling down the street with a convoy of bikers around him. When they arrived at Pete's diner, other members of the Road Warriors were already there, forming an honor guard at the entrance. Sarah stood in the doorway, her hand over her heart, watching as Buck helped Harold off the motorcycle. The old veteran was grinning from ear to ear, looking years younger. "That was something else," Harold said, his eyes bright with excitement. "Reminds me of the time we had to ride those military motorcycles through France. Though we weren't going nearly as safely as you boys do," he added with a chuckle. Inside the diner, everything had changed. The Road Warriors had helped Pete fix up the place over the weekend. The wobbly tables were steadied, the torn booth cushions repaired, and the old neon sign outside now glowed perfectly. But the biggest change was in Harold's corner booth. It had been specially modified. "We hope you don't mind," Mr. Thompson, Buck said, leading Harold to his usual spot. "We had some friends help us with this." The booth now had a small brass plaque on it that read, "Reserved for Sergeant Harold Thompson and friends. Heroes among us." The other customers in the diner watched with amazement as the Road Warriors, once so intimidating, now treated Harold like a beloved grandfather. They hung on his every word as he shared more stories about their relatives who had served, about the war, and about life lessons learned in the hardest of times. Jenny, the English teacher, had started bringing her students to the diner during their lunch break to hear Harold's stories. The Road Warriors would sit quietly, adding their own family histories to the discussion, helping young people understand the true meaning of service and sacrifice. Sarah no longer worried about working the morning shift. Instead, she looked forward to it, watching as Harold held court in his booth, surrounded by leather-clad bikers who had become his most devoted audience. Pete had even started a wall of honor near Harold's booth, displaying photographs of local veterans and their families. That morning, as Harold sipped his coffee and looked around at his unlikely new family, Buck pulled out something from his jacket. "Mr. Thompson, we have something for you." He handed Harold a leather vest, similar to the ones the Road Warriors wore, but different. This one had a special patch that read, "Honorary Road Warrior, Sergeant Harold Thompson, World War II Hero." Harold ran his fingers over the patch, his eyes misty. "Your grandfather would be proud of you, Buck," he said softly. "Not just for this, but for learning what he tried to teach you in that letter, about real strength and doing what's right." The morning sun streamed through the diner's windows, casting a warm glow over the scene. The smell of coffee and friendship filled the air, as an unlikely brotherhood continued to grow stronger with each passing day. 1 month after Harold received his honorary Road Warriors vest, Pete's Diner hosted a special Sunday gathering. The parking lot was filled with motorcycles, their chrome surfaces gleaming in the autumn sun. But today, they were joined by cars and trucks from all over Mill Creek, as the whole town had been invited to what Buck called a hero's recognition. Inside, the diner had been transformed. Red, white, and blue streamers hung from the ceiling, and every table was covered with a clean white tablecloth. Harold's corner booth remained the centerpiece, but now a large American flag hung on the wall behind it. The brass plaque gleamed in the morning light. Harold arrived wearing his leather vest over his best suit, the one Marion had always said made him look distinguished. Buck and 2 other Road Warriors escorted him from his house, walking slowly to match his pace. As they approached the diner, Harold stopped in surprise. A line of people stood outside, creating an honor guard pathway to the door. On one side stood the Road Warriors in their leather vests, and on the other stood veterans from around the county, all in their military uniforms or wearing their service caps. They saluted as Harold walked between them, his back straight and proud despite his cane. Jenny's students were there too, holding handmade signs that read "Thank you Veterans" and "Harold Thompson, our hero." The children had spent weeks interviewing Harold and other local veterans for their history projects, learning firsthand about sacrifice and courage. Inside the diner, Sarah had tears in her eyes as she watched Harold take his place in his booth. Pete stood behind his counter, beaming with pride at how his humble diner had become a place of such meaning. The walls were now covered with photographs, not just of Harold and Richie Mason, but of dozens of local veterans and their families. Buck stepped forward to address the crowd, his voice strong but full of emotion. "A month ago, we thought we were tough guys," he said, looking at his fellow Road Warriors. We confused intimidation with strength and mistook bullying for power. But Mr. Thompson taught us what real toughness looks like. It looks like getting up every morning, no matter how hard life gets. It looks like carrying the memories of fallen friends with honor. It looks like forgiving those who didn't deserve forgiveness. Mrs. Peterson stood up next, surprising everyone. Harold Thompson has been my neighbor for 20 years, she said. Every winter, despite his age, he still checks on all us widows, making sure our heat is working. That's the kind of man we're honoring today. The mayor of Mill Creek presented Harold with a key to the city, but the most touching moment came when Buck unveiled a new sign for the diner. Beneath Pete's name, it now read Home of Heroes, where every veteran has a seat at the table. Harold looked around at all the faces, the road warriors who had become his protectors, the children who now understood their history better, the townspeople who had found their courage, and his old friends who had stood by him through everything. In each face, he saw a little bit of Marion, a little bit of Richie Mason, a little bit of all those young men from that old photograph taken so long ago. You know, Harold said, his voice clear and strong, during the war, we fought for big things. Freedom, democracy, the American way of life. But sitting here today, I realize we were also fighting for small things, for diners where people can gather in peace, for communities that stand together, for the chance to turn enemies into friends. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Pete's diner, warming the gathering of unlikely friends. Outside, the motorcycles gleamed next to family cars, and the American flag waved gently in the breeze. Inside, the smell of coffee and friendship filled the air as Harold Thompson, a 93-year-old veteran, sat surrounded by his new family, proving that it's never too late for courage to change hearts and for love to heal old wounds.